Hi, Matt.
Hey, Will.
How you doing?
Pretty well. How are you?
I'm mildly exhausted. We've got a newborn here, who is like a delight, and I'm proud to have finally taken seriously my responsibility to propagate the human species, or at least shore up the viability of the American pension system. But yeah, I'm a little sleepy.
Well, you've struck a
But
blow for natalism.
yeah, yeah. And how are you?
I'm doing great. I just finished a book tour, which was about 3 weeks, which was great. And yeah, I'm excited to keep talking about the book and then to work on the next one. And I get a little antsy if I don't write for a while. So it's nice to be back in front of my.
You're in sunny San Diego,
Yeah, yeah.
keeping it classy,
Yep.
naturally. I should say you. One thing I have neglected to do is actually to introduce ourselves because I'm an amateur. Uh, I'm Will Wilkinson. This is Matthew Quirk, author of The Directive, uh, a novel. Is that actually the subtitle? The Directive, a novel.
Yeah, that's right. We didn't want people
I
to
like
think
how
it was.
they like to tell you what it is. The directive of food.
Yeah, it could be the directive, and people think it's like printer instructions or something.
uh, as you can see on the cover, the directive has um, a shot of the Washington Monument, um, being phallic and glorious, and behind it, the dome of the Capitol, um, erected, as we all know, with slave labor. And libertarians would say, kept in business by slave labor. Um, this is a thriller set in D.C. It's Matt's second book. The 500, came out. When did that come out?
2012.
2012. Does it seem like a distant memory now?
Yeah, because you always get the books a year after I've more or less buttoned them up.
Yeah.
In some ways, you have to give yourself a refresher on each book and go back and
Yeah.
read it before you go talk about it on the road.
Yeah, and so the directive is the second book in a series that the 500 is the first book of, but it's not necessary to read the 500. The directive is freestanding. There's just some minor references to events in the prior novel. Both feature the protagonist, Mike Ford. And we're going to talk about the book in a second. But before we get to that, let's talk a second about DC. We're both ex-DC people. You're in San Diego. I'm in Houston. We knew each other. We still know each other, but we met each other in DC. You were working as an editor at The Atlantic, and I was, I guess, at Cato. Sometimes we played in the same card game.
Mm-hmm. You never want to
As
play
a,
cards with bloggers during
yeah,
the
we
work
played
week.
cards with bloggers, like those people who now like own the world,
Mm-hmm.
Ezra Klein, and uh, yeah, like here you are writing, blockbuster thriller novels with Little Brown, and Ezra like owns the world, and I'm living in a one-bedroom apartment,
Oh, stop.
Houston,
You're
as it
gathering
gets. So
gathering
so
strength for the takeover of literary America.
yeah. So as you can see, I just glory in the success of all my old friends.
I
Um,
went I went to Vox actually to interview with Matt Iglesias, and I saw Ezra
yeah,
going around in his tech startup offices, and he was doing this Sorkin walk and talk. It was really funny to see, but he has a good operation going over there.
yeah, it's impressive.
Yeah, very much.
It's impressive. Maybe they'll give me a job if I need it. But we haven't come to that yet. Yeah, so like you worked for a number of years as an editor at The Atlantic, but eventually you got out of DC. Why did you decide to leave DC?
Well, I mean, we came to San Diego sort of for a change of pace, and I'm researching the third book out here. So we're still kind of up in the air. I don't know where we'll land ultimately, but this is a great spot for the sequel to the Directive because there's a ton of military out here, and there's a lot of on the water action, and I like getting out in the water. So it's been a fun change of pace for me and for the books.
Yeah, you were you rode crew, didn't you?
No, no, no. I did intramural crew. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I've never been in a boat. I like not even a canoe. No, that's not true. But so that seems glamorous to me. In even intramural crew.
No, because it was like the Bad News Bears, but without the Hollywood ending. So, but it's fun, and I like being on the water. And I grew up kind of sailing little boats, and so it was, it's fun to get back into water stuff. And Mike Ford, the hero of the books, did a turn in the Navy. So you have your character, and he has all these little almost attachment points where you can go back in his life and then see where that takes him in later adventures and things. So right now it's good, and we've met a few people out here who are in the military, and actually a good friend of mine is a fairly prominent Federal Reserve blogger and monetary policy blogger out here, and he was really helpful for the Directive too. So I was surprised that the land of sun worshippers has some secret wonks.
We're everywhere.
Yeah.
We're everywhere. Well, so let's actually talk about your book. You're talking about the Federal Reserve. This is the only book I've ever read that involves the activities of the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee as a central plot point, which makes it pretty wonky as far as a thriller novel goes. So tell us a little bit about like the plot of the novel as you want to describe it, so that you don't give anything away, because it's a ripping yarn with all sorts of twists. I got to the end a few hours ago, and I was like,
Oh, good, good.
ooh, like I didn't guess it. So
Really? Oh, that's great.
I, I
Because you
didn't.
don't want to make it completely obscure, but you don't want to make it too easily guessed. Basically, the idea was to have a heist, and to have a heist that was the largest stakes I could find. And as you're casting about, you come pretty quickly to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which has like 260, $280 billion in gold in the basement. And what was interesting to me was that, bank vaults have been done before, the FRBNY has been done before. And so often in these heists, the loot doesn't affect us all. So it was interesting as I did the research to find out about the trading desk at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which I didn't know was actually how the Federal Reserve System controls the monetary supply. And to realize that that would not only be sort of an interesting way for me to report on some stuff I was fascinated by, which is the monetary supply and how that all works, but also would make for sort of a new target for the thriller. And they have a balance sheet. I think it's $4 trillion, and it backs all our currency. And so once I started learning about that, I was off and running. I thought, oh, cool, I can satisfy my secret wonky impulses, but also have my sort of bolt out of a gun thriller.
So the title, the Directive, refers to the document that comes out of the committee. That is going to tell the desk at the New York Fed Bank, to buy treasuries or to sell treasuries, or in whatever it is that they do.
Yeah, and
to affect the interest rates, which in turn affect the amount, volume of borrowing and lending, which in turn affects the real money supply, the monetary base.
Yeah, and I mean, I was surprised because I wasn't the most up to date on financial stuff, but I could hold my own just, reporting in DC. And I knew that the Fed set interest rates, or I thought I did. And they just did this last week. And then as I dug in, I found out that they don't actually set interest rates. They, at the end of their statement, which they decide, there's actually a directive, which are like marching orders to this trading desk in New York. And the trading desk, let's say they wanted to raise interest rates to 1%. The trading desk the Fed can't just tell banks to do that. The trading desk actually has to buy back government debt or sell government debt to sort of destroy and create money and then get it just so that interest rates get to where they want to be. And they have to induce banks to do it. So I was really surprised, like, one, how they do it. They actually have terminals that open up and they're trading back and forth with 20 big banks. And two, that it works. And that's why we don't have like bread lines. And that's, instead of printing money, that's actually how they raise or lower the value of all the Federal Reserve notes in our pockets.
It sort of works.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, that's fun. That's where you can get into some of the politics of it. But I tell people the whole setup of how the Fed controls the monetary supply through this secret trading desk that no one's ever heard of. And they say, oh, good thriller, nice conspiracy. And I say, well, that's actually true. That's how the Fed does this.
Well, you mentioned it in the book, too, because it is a great thing. I mean, the Fed is, in fact, the creature of a literal conspiracy where, the bankers of New York got together in Jekyll Island, Georgia, to conspire to create this institution that would sort of stabilize the economic system. And so in that, so J.P. Morgan didn't have to keep, bailing out everyone. And so, so like the Fed really, like J.P. Morgan created it, and it is cozy, always has been cozy with the big banks, and so it's ripe for conspiratorial thinking about it because it began as a conspiracy.
Yeah, and the Fed,
as lots of things do, the United States of America began as a conspiracy. I happen to think that, it was, the Canadians were right and they should have just stuck with the English, so I think those guys were terrorists, really. But, the winners write the history, right? So lots of great things or, not terrible things start in conspiracies. So, but anyway, I digress.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fun when you go on their website and there's things like, I heard there was a crazy conspiracy at a place called Jekyll Island to create the Fed. And their sort of myth-busting FAQ is like, well, that actually is true. But, so, I mean, it's just fun. And I like when you're writing a book, when you come away at the end of it, not only with your face melted by the nonstop action, but also knowing some new things.
I had to work for hours to get my face back into shape after reading The Directive by Matthew Quirk. But let's go back and give people like a sense of the plot. So Mike Ford. There was a guy in my high school named Mike Ford. I kind of wonder what happened to him. But this guy Mike Ford is from a family of con men. But he's gone straight. He's gone to like Harvard Law. He was working at this big, consultancy in DC. The first book kind of dealt with how that worked out. Like in this book, he's like got his own, like, does he have his own like little law firm?
Basically, and I know some people have done this in DC and it's really fascinating. If you have a certain profile, you can just sort of work out of like your own shop. And you don't have to do like business development. People just come to you, and it's really cool because there are people who work this way, and it's similar but different to a kind of classic private eye setup. He worked for sort of the most powerful fixer in Washington, and then got out because it was a very compromised situation. And then at the beginning of this book, he has enough work just from people who know his reputation that he has a little storefront in Northern Virginia and can do the work that way. So, he has his day job, and this book, it's about his family, because at the beginning of this, he has the honest life he's always wanted. He kind of got into trouble when he was young and then worked really hard to get away from his family. And then figured out maybe they're not all bad. And he has a really great fiance at the beginning of this, and is finally has... What's that again?
They're on the brink of marriage.
They're on the brink of marriage, yeah.
With them, shopping for items to put on the wedding registry, which, this kind of ex-tough can't really, tolerate. They're like, I don't know, where are they? Like some fancy department store.
Yeah, they're at Bergdorf in New York. So it's fun because he has everything he wants, and I mean, he's not a kind of guy who would like pick a fight for no reason, but he has a lot of his own personal history that he can't deal with. And then all of a sudden he's in Mayberry. He's in Delray, Virginia, which is like part of Alexandria. Incredibly cute and quaint.
Yeah.
And he's shopping for place settings, and he has this criminal past that he can't really talk about in his current situation. And then he finds out that his brother, who's his old partner in crime, who he sort of had to boot out of his life, which broke his heart because his brother was unreconstructed and a total slime. His brother shows up in town. He's working for different security companies, and he seems to have reformed. So Mike says, great, there's somebody who's been through this, and also, blood. And so we can talk about it, and I can sort of square who I am now with where I'm coming from in a way he can't talk about, like breaking into places with the people he meets at like cocktail parties. So he's like, great, everything's going to be perfect. And it's right before the run up to his wedding. And, his brother, and one of these ironies, it's the first time his brother has ever done the honest thing, and it all goes to hell. And he finds himself in the middle of this plot centered on the Federal Reserve. And then it's a lot of stuff about siblings. There's a lot of stuff about marriage too. But it's one of those things where even if in your conscious mind you wouldn't step in, if you see somebody about to hurt family, even if it's somebody who you would kill yourself, he's driven you so crazy. If somebody else goes to hurt them, you'll step in almost by instinct. And then that's what kicks off the all the plot and gets Mike into the middle of things.
About family loyalty and the limits of trust.
Yeah.
Between brothers, and it's I loved all that stuff. I always wanted a brother,
They have their ups and downs, as you see in the book. I love mine, but I'll hang out with them. I'm the youngest brother, and I'll be home for a week. And we're all grown-ups now. And I'll be like, I'm an accomplished grown-up in the world. You should pay attention to me. And my mom's like, they don't have to pay attention to you. And then they start picking on me. So all that stuff goes deep. And it was fun to draw on it for the book.
Yeah, so Mike Ford's brother, Jack, he's tried to go straight. Mike wants to, ask him to be his best man. But instead, he ends up getting drawn into this shadowy plot to pull a heist on the Federal Reserve, and Mike gets stuck in order to save his brother's skin, plotting out how to actually execute this heist, how to break into the Fed building, and how to steal the directive so that people can, unknown parties lurking in the background can act on the market information that is not yet published.
And the thing with Mike I wanted to play with is, what if the only way to keep this honest life were to go back to your criminal past in a very well-motivated way where, he's just trying to do the right thing. And it's the same time that he is it's at the same time he is getting married, which is when you're supposed to be at your most respectable, and he is trying to compartment those two parts of his life. And the question is, will that secrecy ultimately destroy everything he's worked for over the years?
So at some level, this is like I won't go further into the plot lest we lest we spoil anything. There's a lot, and this is one of the things that like I'm in an MFA program for fiction, literary fiction, which is itself just a genre that usually just means doesn't have a story that you care about. Uh, but this is very very unlike this stuff that I've been reading in my program, and it was incredibly refreshing to like be like I got caught up in a story, right? And one of the fun things is that there's lots of details, and I see how important that is to the genre. Lots of details about the technology that's going to be used, the technique that he's using to, so like basically Mike is a B&E guy, and like he knows how to like get into places. And there's lots of details about thumb drives and little cameras and lock picking, and that really is one of the pleasures of the book, is like you feel like you kind of learn something while at the same time it gives a sense of realism to what is ultimately sort of fantastic. But you have this sense that there are these real technologies that could be used to maybe do something like this.
Right. Well, I mean, the just a side note on the MFA stuff is they never work on story. You're in a seminar for 2 hours and you're going over one paragraph. So it's fun because I did some literary stuff to sit down with the literary people and be like, do you know about the 3-act structure? Have you read, and you pass them around like Samizdat, you're like, have you read Story by Robert McKee or Screenplay by Sid Field? And they're like, oh my God, this is how you get people to go page after page.
The screenwriting stuff is kind of like you sort of like are like it's strange. I mean, I could go on about that, and a part of it has to do with just like in MFA programs, you do workshops, which is like a group of people sit around a table and talk about each other's work, and the workshop structure only really it doesn't work very well for the novel. It works best for the short story. So there's a heavy thrust on the short story, and short stories don't need that kind of narrative arc. They work in a more sort of lyrical. It's a form that works in a more. It's just got a different shape.
Yeah.
And what holds a good short story together isn't the same thing that holds a longer narrative arc together. And so, partly as a consequence of that, MFA trained writers can often get good at writing these sort of like gem-like short stories that have these kind of like epiphanic, lyrical feeling of realization. And they're short enough that just like the lovely writing and the whatever else is going on is enough to hold your attention for 15, 20 pages until you get to the payoff. But yeah, there isn't a lot on story. One of my workshop directors, Matt Johnson, who wrote a great book, Pym, that came out a couple years ago. He was very he would like pick up his iPad and be like, why the fuck are they going to read your book if they just like here's the Kindle, I can one poke away, I can like watch anything I want on Netflix.
Oh yeah.
Like why am I going to turn the next page in your book? And it's like nobody likes to hear it actually but yeah, you gotta keep people roped in. So is that how you learned the art of storytelling? Like you read McKee and Sid Field and things like that?
Yeah, that was good. I mean, it's all you can that was good for formalizing it. It's like someone explaining to you what you're doing, and then you realize, oh, that's why I really felt like I was like bushwhacking in this part, and in this part I felt like I had a trail. Um, so that, yeah, was super helpful in getting the structure of things and kind of reining me in. Um, and then, one thing you learn is it's just really crucial to have, for the thrillers especially, like a clean plot where from the opening pages you raise this question. This is all from McKee of like, will justice be served? And you have a sense of where the book is going towards by the end. And the opening pages like conjure the ending. And it's almost like music where it won't feel resolved until it gets to that final, like fifth to first. So, for this book, and to go back to that sort of technological question, it was really enjoyable when I found this like clean through line, which is a heist at the Fed. And I can embroider things that were going on in my own life in that, getting married, brotherhood, settling down. And then the really fun part was to do the research. For the second book especially, you can call people and say, hey, I'm a novelist. Like, I'm on Barnes and Noble. I have a website. I'm not totally insane. Now tell me how to break into the Fed. And it's a great way to procrastinate. And there are these security guys. The guy I talked to is great. He's like the best lockpicker in the hacker community, like DEF CON and everything. And his name is Deviant. And most of those guys have a sideline in doing security consulting for corporations and government. And they have these red teams, which actually you hire to try to break into your corporate campus or government facility. So these guys actually know how to break into places. And when you're writing a novel, there's so much like cruft of old thrillers in your head of breaking into places means like tunneling, and it means black turtlenecks, and it means doing gymnastics through a field of lasers. And
I was disappointed by the lack of black turtlenecks in this book.
Well, there's a really funny thing where in an early draft, I had a bunch of really corny cliches. And in a later draft, the brother who's rattled by everything, they're trying to case the Fed, keeps suggesting terrible ideas, all of which were in the original draft of my book that I threw out. They're my own terrible ideas. And it was such a breath of fresh air to actually find out how professionals would do it. And so that brings you to all the social engineering stuff. And the technology is very accurate. And, that reporting is really fun. And it's also a great way to procrastinate. Like, I learned to pick locks. I'm like always emailing with these lock picking guys to find like new gadgets and
Do you use that now? When you came here to Houston to give a reading, and like you did a lock picking demonstration, do you use it? Like, have you ever I am expecting you to confess to a crime right now. But do you find it a practical skill?
Absolutely, yeah. My friend and I, we got his car locked into a lot in San Francisco. A parking lot had like 20-foot fences. And I didn't have anything to pick the lock with. And my wife was saying like, oh, my husband writes thrillers about breaking into and out of places. And everybody's like, all right, well, what are you going to do for us? We had parked in a school parking lot, and there were some parents and teachers there, and they were all locked in. And I was like, I can't do anything, buddy. I write the books. But then I looked, and actually the hinges on this huge sliding gate were vulnerable. So a parent and I just like lifted them up and pulled them off. And that's more of a firefighter's trick to go after the hinges, but that came in handy. And then we were locked out of my in-laws' house in Virginia, maybe Thursday or Friday night. And I was working on one of the locks while we didn't have the garage code because I had my picks from doing a reading. And then my wife got in through the garage, and I was so stubborn that I kept at it. And I opened their door, and I was like, damn, I would have been inside in 30 seconds, and I would have had the best book anecdote for these readings. Just lock me back out. But I was really surprised, because I don't try to do it on working locks, but I was playing with it that night that I got into about like 2 of the 3, like Schleg, pretty legitimate deadbolts on their house.
Yeah. When I was in grad school at the University of Maryland, the University of Maryland graduate student housing, like you could actually you like because you mentioned in the book that it doesn't work to use like a credit card.
Mm-hmm.
You could open anyone's door in my building
Oh,
with
man.
like student ID.
Shimming it, or just any ID would open any door swiping?
Just shimming it in there to get it behind the deadbolt. It would kind of fuck up your card a little bit, but yeah, it would work. But those are bad locks, and that's what
Well, the
hopefully.
thing, I mean, we have a little bit of time during this. If you look at a latch, it looks like this, and then there's a little metal finger that's D-shaped in cross-section behind it. So this would be like the latch, and there's that little finger. That's called a dead latch, and that's the reason you can't shim things anymore, because you can push the latch, but you can't push that finger. So it's like, it was really heartbreaking for a child of television to realize that wouldn't work.
Damn it. Well, let's talk a little bit about like there's a kind of subtextual politics in this book that I found interesting, where your hero Mike is he's a good guy trying to do good. His main client is like an internet billionaire or millionaire or something who's like interested in anti-corruption as a kind of a pet issue, and is into sort of like Larry Lessig, campaign finance stuff, get the money out of politics. But he's presented as being kind of impatient and vain and not really understanding how the system works. Whereas throughout the plot of the book, you get a sense of the system as being very deeply penetrated by sort of malicious operators, and that there's a kind of endemic nature to corruption, and that in this case the good guy won, but he only wins in some way by, like, he doesn't come out clean exactly either. And it seemed to me that there's like a statement in there kind of about the impossibility of doing anything in politics to sort of fight corruption that isn't itself partly corrupt.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at political fiction, it tracks pretty clearly. Like, if you watch a Capra movie, like, it's corrupt, but the common man wins. And then, I mean, there's nothing new here. It's like a post-Watergate thing. You can win the battle, but you lose the war, or you have to keep fighting. And it's really interesting, because I think that's a view of politics that is incredibly common today, and rightly so. It's just like it's just such a bad scene in Congress. And Americans, I think it's like 7% approval ratings now of Congress.
Yeah.
I just read there's the SEC just subpoenaed some congressmen, some congressional aides, because they were leaking upcoming healthcare decisions to investors. And it was this crazy separation of powers thing. So, and it's also something where Americans' political outlook, which I think is pretty valid, is fairly cynical. Maybe cynical is not the right word, just justifiably depressed, And there's also something with fiction. Nowadays, people like it to acknowledge the complexity of the world.
Yeah.
So if you have something tied up in a bow and perfect, then people realize life is messier than that. So it's one of these things where the reality of politics and, the nature of taste in fiction these days seem to come together. And, it's also how I feel about a lot of the issues that come up in the book. There is a lot of corruption. There's a lot of regulatory capture. And, you don't have to get too crazy to go from a conspiracy thriller about financial corruption to the reality of, everything that's happened since the crash. And as I've been doing some homework while I've been out on the road promoting the book, I found all these crazy things about evidence that the Federal Reserve's big decisions seem to leak out to investors before they're made public.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just a ton of evidence on that, and it's very disheartening. So it's one of those stranger than fiction things, but it's a bit of cynicism, and that's definitely the tone of like government thrillers. There's a note of paranoia, but it's nice when your subject matter bears it out, and you're not just being cynical because that's the genre.
Yeah, it's not cynical in this quite the way that, say, like House of Cards is.
Oh, it's just preposterous.
Which one of the things that I like about House of Cards, like I noticed that a lot of my sort of libertarian friends seem to like it, and I think they like it just because it has a non-romantic view of politics. But the whole thing, it's actually a kind of progressive cynicism is the model of politics, where a single billionaire has bought all of Congress and the presidency. And it's like, there's not even another billionaire. Like if you had two billionaires with competing interests, it would get too complicated.
Right.
And so there's this kind of fantasy that corruption is simple, that it actually just involves a few bad rich people rigging the system. Whereas the more disheartening view is that it's pervasive and small ball, and that it's just everybody's chipping away at every single margin all the time, and you can't point at the Koch brothers or George Soros. It's every single business interest who has something at stake when a regulatory matter is being decided. They have a big incentive to get that fixed in their favor, and there's a tendency for them to do that, but it's lots of small interests doing it. And just when you add them all up, it turns out to kind of endemic corruption. And it's actually a soothing fantasy to see the corruption as being a function of just a few powerful malign forces.
And it makes for a better, easier to digest book. Whereas like everyday graft in a place like New Jersey or Baltimore is like incredibly hard to portray and requires a lot of like patience. And this is a balance in the thrillers. I don't know if I try to do it more than others. You don't want your crime to be like James Bond or like Thomas Crown Affair, where you have like a gentleman burglar. So you really have to balance.
Sounds like a great job, man.
Yeah, you're like, I was bored with my catamaran. So you want it to be realistic, but real life is very tedious and not satisfying. And so you have to balance, like, when you're portraying criminals, like most bank jobs are by drug addicts, and they're very poorly done, and they're like feudally violent, and it would just be incredibly depressing. It'd be like a 70s movie to show those guys. And so, but you don't want to go to the other end where crime is a silly James Bond or gentleman thief glamour thing. And so you have the same thing with corruption. And I think it's nice when you can take real things. Like the first book I wrote was about political corruption, and this one is about financial corruption. So it's nice when you can take people's desire to see it romanticized and made dramatic and taken as fiction, and then get in a lot of reality and teach them about real, not that the books are like pedagogic or anything, but teach them about get real detail in there because, it's good to have well informed conspiracy theories. And also, people can just feel that's real. And I think it makes the works much more enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish we had more time to talk, but I actually can hear my crying baby uh,
Okay.
outside. You did make it all very enjoyable. So, the book is The Directive by Matthew Quirk, available now at fine booksellers. It is published by Hachette. So, is Amazon doing anything to fuck you over?
Um, yes, we have some headwinds from Amazon.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, but you can still get it there, and it doesn't have the big shipping delays. You could also go to your local indie, or Barnes and Noble, or But if you have that Prime, you want to go to Amazon. There's no shame in that game.
All right. Well, it's a ripping yarn, and I highly recommend it. And good luck with it. And thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Cool.
All
Take
right,
it easy.
later.